All right. So, let me just make sure it's actually recording because it didn't yell at me. All right. So, welcome back to Ethics and Information Technology. So, first and foremost, are there any questions? Information tech. Are there any questions from anything we covered last time, or anything that was on the syllabus, or any business stuff? Any questions at all?
Nope.
Alrighty then. If we've got no questions, I can jump straight into the stuff today. So, today's plan is just to talk about the ethics side of ethics and information technology. But one business point before we start, I will generally, whenever I email you all, you should expect your first email, like mass email from me this weekend. I will be sending out all the readings again and just an email to make sure. So if you haven't yet filled out the your name and email in the Blackboard on the, what the heck is it called? The discussion board section, make sure to do that ASAP. I won't take off any points for lateness or anything on this first one. So just get it in. Now, in those emails, I'm rarely going to call this class Ethics and Information Technology. I'm generally going to call it Cyberethics, or very often no dash here, just Cyberethics. Now, any guesses for why I'm going to call it Cyberethics instead of Ethics and Information Technology? Any good guesses?
Easier to say.
Yeah, it's easier to say, and mostly it's fewer letters for me to type. So expect, if you ever see something from your cyberethics professor, that's me, and I'm generally going to call this class Cyberethics. Where did I put my eraser? There it is. So, but today, as I said, we're going to be talking about the ethics side of things. So we started talking about this last class. In last class, what are some of the things we said about ethics? What did we say ethics was? Anyone remember?
Basically a set of moralities.
Yeah, it's a study or set of moralities. We're going to be talking about it as the study of morality. So what I want to do today is talk about what exactly does this mean? What do we mean by study of morality? Which basically is going to come down to what do we mean by morality and how does one study it? So that's really what I'm going to talk about. Yes, conduct as well is another element of this. And so when we're talking about morality, what is it that we said counts as morality? We said it governs our conduct. So morality. It's something that governs our conduct, but what other things can we say about morality? What are some of the key ideas we use, or some of the, what is right, what is wrong? So right versus wrong. What else do we sometimes talk about here? Yeah, it's these are right and wrong, and they're things that govern behavior. But so yeah, morality is tied in with our behavior. What does morality do? Well, it in some sense tells you how you should behave. What counts as behaving in the right way? What counts as behaving in the wrong way? What are some of the other, I guess they're small words, but important words that sometimes come in with morality? Yes, I'm playing Hangman.
Good versus bad.
Yeah, good versus bad. There will be various points during this semester in which I am looking for a word, and I will put up the number of letters, and you can start guessing letters. Like I will really, we can play Hangman if nothing else. So yeah, in this case, good versus bad. So what counts as good behavior? What counts as bad behavior? Or what counts as a good action versus a bad action? So these are the sorts of things that are tied in with morality. And what you can really think of morality as, to give it a big, fancy definition, and like all definitions, this one is useful but not perfect. The one the book gives is system of rules for, what's the exact word? System of rules for guiding human conduct, and by human conduct here just means actions, and principles, and again, remember I can't spell, so if at any point any of this doesn't make sense, just let me know and I'll try to respell it. principles for evaluating those rules. Principles for evaluating those rules. So this is the fancy definition of morality: a system of rules for guiding human conduct or human actions and principles for evaluating those rules. So this is a big fancy way of saying things. What exactly does this mean? Well, first off, what do we mean by a rule here? What is a rule? And I mean this in the most flat-footed, boring way possible. What are we talking about with rules?
People that something that people should follow.
Yeah, they're basically sentences that tell you what you should and shouldn't do. So I'm actually going to put law up here in the top left because this actually is going to be the next element we tie into. And so another example of a type of rule is like a law. And in some sense, we use law in a general sense where like there are laws of nature or laws of physics or laws of mathematics. But then there's the more specific sense of the law in the sense of the things that are in the Constitution and everything else. So I'm going to come back to law in a second, but laws are generally another example of rules. So a thing that says pay your taxes on whatever tax day is, that is another example of a rule. So a rule is just a sentence that says what you should or shouldn't do or what's expected of you. And so in this case, you can have rules for many different things. This is going to be rules that govern human conduct or human action in general. So moral rules are things that apply, when we think of morality, we think of them as applying really big picture. It's not like there's specialized, like the 10 Commandments aren't thou shalt not kill unless you really dislike the person, or thou shalt not kill unless your name is George, then you can kill anybody you want. It's these general sorts of rules about what you should and shouldn't do. And then it's principles for evaluating those rules. So what does this mean? What do we mean by principles for evaluating rules? Well, what is it to evaluate something? Just generally, again, if you were to get a test question that said, evaluate this idea, what would that mean you have to do?
Solve it.
Say that again, Marcus?
Solve the question or whatever it's asked.
Yes, solve it, or we have analyze here. So yeah, what you're doing is you're looking at it and considering what makes it good, what makes it bad. So in this case, a system of rules for human conduct and then principles for evaluating those rules. So in this particular case, we can take a particular example of a moral rule that we all like generally think is true. Thou shalt not kill. So in this case, we have a system of rules. One of the rules is thou shalt not kill. And then morality is the way in which you go about evaluating that. So you might go, why is this a good rule? So in the case of thou shalt not kill, why is thou shalt not kill a good rule? Or why is it a bad rule? Or why does it sometimes have exceptions? That's all it means to evaluate these rules. So what we can think of ethics doing is just this sort of thing. It's these rules for how you should behave and principles for evaluating these rules. Now, what are some examples of ethical rules in our everyday life? Like I just gave thou shalt not kill. And that's one that we generally, everybody worldwide accepts as a general rule for governing behavior. What are some others? Don't steal. That's another really good one. So I'm going to erase good versus bad. So we have don't steal. Steal. Don't kill. Don't cheat, don't lie. Don't lie. Don't cheat. These are all really good ones. Respect others. So we've got a bunch of don'ts. We also have a do. Do, show, respect. So these are the sorts of things we're talking about. Now, these are all really good ones. And you could come up with lists and lists and lists of these. We could sit here all day just coming up with moral rules. But that would be a very boring class very quickly, and most of you would begin your online shopping, and I wouldn't blame you. So these sorts of things are what we mean by moral rules. But one other thing to note is, and this is something I want to talk about, is not every sort of rule. The reason this isn't a perfect definition for ethics, or I mean for morality, is that not every sort of rule that guides human conduct and principles that are used to evaluate those rules, not every type of rule that governs behavior is something we want to say is moral in nature. So what is another sort of rule that we have to follow that isn't quite identical to the rules of morality? I'll give you, now, a lot of these will have overlap with them. You can think of it kind of like a Venn diagram. You know what I mean by Venn diagram? These stupid things you had to do in class where like there's some things that are both, like there are some animals that are two-legged and there are some animals that aren't two-legged. So you, or some two-legged things like statues that aren't animals, and then here's the yeah. So Venn diagrams, you can think of it. There's a lot of things that are moral principles and also in these other sorts of rules, but not everything that is a, if we say this is morality, not everything that is a rule for guiding human conduct counts as a moral one. So what are some other types of ones? I'll give you a clue. One of them is written on the board. Right in the shiny spot. It's hard to see. Law, yeah. Law is another type of principle. So you might think that all morality is laws. So what are the moral rules? Well, they're just the laws. But there's an important thing to notice, which is that the law and morality have relationships to each other, but they're not the exact same thing. So think about this. Why do you think I'm saying that the law or the legal rules are somewhat different than the moral rules? Why do we not say they're the exact same thing? Any ideas?
Because some laws can be debated to be wrong instead of
Yeah. So there are laws in the world that you want to say are immoral, or at the very least aren't the same as moral law. So what are some things that are legal, but or are illegal, and no, things that are, let me think of the best way of doing it. What are some laws that are immoral? What are some things that are legal, but are not things we want to say are moral? That's a really good one. Laws back, Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws, what am I talking about with Jim Crow laws? Little quick history lesson.
Basically, racism against black people, like separating them from like the back of the into the back of the bus and other stuff.
Yeah, so there were laws in the United States that were in place basically for 100 years after the end of, well, I guess they're about 30 years after the Civil War, in which they weren't really in place. They came in place in the late 1800s and then came out of effect in like the 1960s. They started being overturned. But yeah, they were segregation laws. They basically said if you are black, or basically if you are non-white, you cannot eat at the same restaurants as white people. You cannot use the same bathrooms as white people. You cannot go to the same schools as white people. And we look back now, and the majority of people think those laws were bad. Those laws shouldn't be allowed. Other ones are things around police violence, the degree to which police are allowed to use lethal force on civilians in the process of fighting crime, is at the very least, depending on your views of this thing, I'm going to try to hide my cards, but I'm sure you can guess what my views on this matter are. And if it's not clear yet, it will be by the end of the semester. But depending on your views, it's at least up for debate whether the police who shoot unarmed individuals of color and get away with it and don't go to jail. There are big debates on news channels all the time about whether that's okay. So at the very least, it is legal for that to happen, but we can ask, is it really, should it be moral? Another one, in America, what was perfectly legal until 1863? Slavery, yes. Slavery is another one, and there are still places in which certain types of things that we might call slavery are practiced and not illegal. So these are the sorts of things we're talking about. So what we see is there are perfect cases in which something is legal, but we want to say, but not moral. And then on the flip side, there are things that are morally okay, but not legal. So what are some examples of things that are perfectly, like, nobody thinks you're immoral if you do it, but technically speaking, they are illegal? Jaywalking, that's the classic case. How many of you have broken the law by crossing the street when you didn't have the little white crossing person? If you are alive and you are from New York City, you've done it. Like, nobody in New York City, I generally find a good way of like differentiating like people who really identify and have lived in New York for a while versus people who are from out of town is, do you actually stop at the crosswalk? If you do, you're not from New York. Like, that's just the way it is. Because there are places in which like you can literally get a ticket for jaywalking. I would never want to live in one of those places, and I pride myself on being an excellent jaywalker. I like to like there's like that Frogger element to it where you have to like get as close as possible to the car before it passes so that you're then ready to like save as much time as possible as you're crossing the street. So yeah, so jaywalking is a classic case. Another one is for those of you who are drivers, how many of you actually stay under the speed limit at all times? No, nobody stays under the like it. I mean, yeah, I sometimes stay under the speed limit, but I generally stay 5 miles an hour over the speed limit. Nobody stays under the speed limit. Here's a fact. If you stay under the speed limit all the time, you are at least 95 years old. That's just a general fact. There's a nice that's a nice that's a nice Venn diagram we could draw here. But yeah, so these are things where morality is not the same as the law. Now, very often the law is designed to capture what we think are right and wrong, moral, immoral. So for instance, why is it 10 miles over? Generally, I found that as long as you're within like 10 miles over, no one's gonna pull you over. And you know, we're busy people, you gotta get places. Generally on the highway, I try to go exactly 14 miles an hour over because the way the police tickets work is every 5 miles, it's a bigger fine. And in the 5 to 10, if it's the 0 to 5 or 5 to 10 range, it's not worth their time to pull you over. And usually on the highway, if it's the 10 to 14 range, it's not worth it either. So as long as you're like within that range, no one's going to pull you over. Once you start getting like 20 miles an hour over the speed limit, it definitely is worth their time. So this is called How to Speed with Professor Neely. All right. Now, abortions. So this is another one in which I think a case like this is another nice, clear case in which it really is not clear. First off, there's a lot of disagreement about which side is right, which side is wrong. And then also there are different laws in different places about it. So abortion you can think of as a moral or ethical issue. Some people, as a matter of fact, think it's right. Some people, as a matter of fact, think it's wrong. Some places it's legal, some places it's illegal, but this is a classic case that really shows the difference between the law and morality and moral issues. Because everyone who has a strong view on abortion thinks it's true universally, whether it's right or wrong. And then, but as a matter of fact, each place has like there's no gray area in the United States law around it. Well, in a particular state at a particular time, it's black and white. But then what a society as a whole thinks about it changes by person to person. Now, generally the way we think of abortion is that there is a right answer, and what we're doing is disagreeing about what that right answer is. And the goal generally, and this is a tie-in between law and morality, is generally we think something is right or wrong, and then we design laws to capture that fact. So for instance, why is it that it's illegal to murder someone? Well, it's illegal to murder someone because we think it's wrong and bad to murder people. So we put a system in place that punishes people who do it and doesn't punish people who don't do it. So that's the way to kind of think of this. And yeah, one's views, I don't want to get into the abortion question in this class. That's mostly because it's not a cyber ethical issue, but that is a classic case of the sort of issue that you could look at in an applied ethics class. And if you choose to take an applied ethics class, that's almost certainly one of the debates you will look at, because people have been debating this for a very long time. There's a lot of overlap with religious questions, and depending on your religious views, it can greatly affect your views on abortion. So yeah, so this is a thorny issue I don't want to get into in this class, but it's a really great case to show an example of a moral issue and to help tease apart morality from ethical issues. Now, what are some other types of rules? So we've got morality is rules and the law is rules. But what are some other types of rules that aren't quite moral? And aren't quite legal either. Anyone have any ideas? There are other rules that govern human conduct and that we evaluate and that we try to follow. And if you don't do them right, in some sense, you're doing the incorrect or bad thing. But it's also not quite moral, and it's not written into the law. Anyone have any ideas? All right, imagine we were in a classroom right now, and I could see all your lovely faces, and one of you wanted to, Cynthia, you're spot on, so let me just finish this thought, and then I'm gonna come back to this. So, we're all sitting in the classroom, and one of you wanted to ask a question. What would you do? How would you go about asking your question? Yeah, you'd raise your hand. Exactly. Hand raising. Now, hand raising, in a certain sense, what would be the case if you raised your foot instead? Are you breaking the law? Like, say you were like, hey, professor, pay attention to me, and you lifted your foot up. It's weird, and in some sense, you're doing the wrong thing. But is what you're doing, like, morally? Is anyone going to think you're a terrible person for doing that? Like, are they going to judge you and not want to be around you? I mean, they might think you're a bit odd, but they're not going to, like, say, they're not going to be like, you belong in an insane asylum and you should go to jail. No one's going to say that. Marcus, you were going to say something.
Oh no, I was just gonna say maybe somebody would. I don't know. It's never happened. So
yeah, at the very least, if you were to do it, like, why is it that no one else does it? Yeah, it's in some sense disrespectful, but it's not quite immoral. Like, if one of you were to do that, I'd be like, this is the class clown. That's kind of funny, but it's gonna get old very quickly. But I wouldn't try to send you to jail. And I wouldn't try to accuse you of being like a corrupt individual. Rather, it's just that you're breaking these like unwritten rules of politeness or respect or unwritten rules of how you should behave in a certain context. So let's call these, I don't know what to call them, rules of social norms is really exactly what they are. And we're going to come back to this again later in the semester. Social norms are just these unwritten rules that we have where they're not really tied in, or social conduct rules. So there's this other set as well. And these aren't quite the same as morality. Because morality, there's a strong sense of if you break a moral rule, you're a bad person and you deserve to be punished for it. If you break a social norm, it makes everyone around you and you feel kind of uncomfortable, but there's not a sense in which you're like a bad person. Also, another way to think of these social norms is they're very often the sorts of things that can be, social norms are the things that foreign tourists mess up. And everyone's just like, oh, it's okay, they're a tourist, they don't know any better. Let's correct them, but we're not gonna like kick them out of our country. But if like a tourist comes in and just starts punching people, and they're like, I'm a tourist, I didn't know any better. You're like, no, you should know. You are being immoral. You don't just punch people in the face. So that's another type of thing. So we've got moral rules, laws, social norms, and all of these are rules that govern human conduct. So what is it about the ethical rules that makes them ethical rules versus the other things? Now let me pull up my definition. My computer that is down here, of course, locked. So the book defines ethical rules as having these 4 components. And these are, I want to talk about each of these things because they're useful to understand for differentiating moral rules from other sorts of rules. And also they're things we can kind of refer back to later in class. And they're useful for understanding when you're going about the next question, which is how do you study morality? How is it that you do ethics? So there are 4 criteria. If anyone wants to shout them out from the textbook or has the textbook there, feel free. But if you don't want to, I can just write them down. First one is universal. Where are they? Universal, rational, impartial, and public. So these are the criteria or the features or what's the best way of thinking of these? These are really the characteristics that differentiate moral rules from the others, is they have these big criteria. Now, like all things, these aren't 100% perfectly clear, but what I want to do is talk through each of these things, and we can understand the elements of them tied in with morality and tied in to understand what moral rules are a bit better by looking at these features of them. So when we say something is universal, what do we mean? What is it for something to be universal?
For everybody.
Yeah, it's for everyone or the same everywhere at all times. So that's all we mean by universal. So if we contrast moral rules with laws, what we see is, are laws the same everywhere?
No.
No. So we have already talked about some. For instance, in America in 1800, it was legal to own black slaves. That is a thing that was legally true. But it seems like with morality, we want to say, whether it was legal or not, it was still wrong. So there's a sense in which the moral rules, what's right and wrong in a moral sense, are the same everywhere. Same thing with social norms. Like if you were taught to raise your foot instead of raise your hand, then that's what everyone would do. In the same way, in the United States, you meet somebody who is you meet someone for the first time. How do you greet them?
You say
in a
hello.
non-COVID era, or in a COVID era, I guess.
Handshake.
Yeah, handshake, or I guess these days it's an elbow bump. But if you're meeting like a close friend who you haven't seen in a while, how do you behave? What do?
You hug them.
You hug them. If you shake your best friend's hand, it's like a little bit weird. Like, hello, father, it is so good to see you. Like if you're shaking your father's hand in that way, like you probably aren't super close to your dad. In the same way, though, is this the same everywhere? Is everywhere you go in the world, do you shake hands?
Nope.
No.
No, there are many places which you do other things. So in Japan, things are different. I never know I know there's bowing. I'm sorry to show my cultural ignorance here. I know there's a type of bowing that gets done, but I don't know the details. I know that though that just like in America, like there are different ways to shake hands. Like you don't shake your hand just like the worst thing in the world. And I will say one of the side effects of COVID that I don't necessarily miss is the limp fish handshake. I really don't like a limp fish handshake. Shake someone's hand, you gotta mean it. But that's just a pet peeve of mine. A little bit more about the inside of my strange head. So yeah, but that's what we mean by universal. So things that are universal are things like the laws of physics. Like if I'm in the United States and I drop this pen, it's gonna fall. Why? Well, there's these universal laws of gravity that apply everywhere. If I was on Jupiter and I was standing on it and I did this, it would also fall. If I was 1,000 years ago, it would fall. If it was 100 years in the future, it would fall. So long as you're near a massive object that has a center of gravity such that it warps space-time, it will be the case that this falls. So that's what we mean by universal. And moral rules seem like this. If it's wrong to kill today, then it was wrong to kill then. Or at the very least, we think that's the case. There are other views on this that if you want to talk about at some point during the semester, we can. But for now, generally, when we think of morality, we think of them as universal. All right. Rational. What does it mean for something to be rational? Or another way of thinking of this is only applies to rational entities. What does this mean? What is it for something to be rational?
Humans, nothing that can't like think or speak, basically. Like reptiles, whatever it is, like anything that's not humans, pretty much.
Yeah, rational generally means capable of complicated thoughts and complex problem solving and thinking about things in an abstract way. So for instance, human beings we're able to think about things very far away. We're able to reason in these ways. And it seems like we, at this point, humans and only maybe a couple other animals are capable of rational thought. And in science fiction movies, the robots are, or the computers are. Yeah, rationality is about logical reasoning. So if A is true and B is true, then C is true, that sort of thing. Or if all birds have feathers and Bert is a bird, then Bert has feathers. That's what we mean by logical reasoning. So rational just means it's capable of logical reasoning. So why do we say that morality is rational in this sense? Well, because if you look at morality, it looks like the rules of morality follow logical laws. So for instance, if it's illegal to murder George, if it's immoral to murder and it's immoral to steal, then it's immoral to murder and immoral to steal. Or I guess a better way of putting this is if it's immoral to murder and it's immoral to steal, then it's immoral to murder and steal. It's not like, so, if A is true and B is true, then A and B are true. So it follows the rules of logical reasoning. Also, another element is that we only think that what sorts of things can be held accountable morally speaking? What can we say has done something morally right and morally wrong? Can your dog do something morally right or morally wrong?
Depending on which perspective. Are you talking from the dog's perspective or the human side?
Here's the question. If you were to, extreme case, you were to bite a baby in the face, would you be doing something morally wrong that we think you should be punished for?
Oh, yeah, then we should
Yeah.
be punished because we're biting a baby's face.
Yeah, you're biting a baby's face. If a dog does it, should we think the dog has done something wrong in a moral sense? Like that it shows something that this isn't like a evil dog? No, it just shows like the dog is like, it didn't do something morally wrong. It did something we don't like. And we might have to put the dog down to put it, like, to put other people, like, keep other people from getting attacked. But there's no sense in which we wanted to say, like, this dog is morally responsible for this thing. Just you put the dog down. You don't send it to dog jail and hope that it changes its character. And yeah, if anything, we want to say that the person who's morally responsible is the human owner who's responsible for letting the dog off the leash and biting the baby in the face. So there's some sense here of a difference between the human and the dog. And it seems like the dog we kind of treat almost as like the dog didn't fully understand what it was doing. It doesn't have a sense of moral right and wrong. The human, though, like a human who bites a baby in the face, it seems like, that person should be punished because they understand what they're doing. This is tied in with another case of what is the most common defense given in court whenever a murder or something is committed?
I didn't do it.
I didn't do it. Now imagine that you're caught. Say that again, Jorge.
Insanity, I think.
Insanity, exactly. When somebody says I'm insane, I had no idea what I was doing. My brain doesn't work right. We generally don't think they should just go to jail with everyone else. We think they should go to a mental asylum and have themselves, in some sense, mentally fixed. Now, whether that makes sense or not, let's put that to the side. That's something for a different question. But the reason that we say like an insane person can't do something morally wrong is because they don't have the rational capacity to count as a moral agent. So it seems like this is another element of morality. It seems like you have to be able to understand what you're doing. Now, this is different from something like a social norm. Like you might not understand why you should shake hands instead of bow. And in some sense, there's no rational difference between them. Like, why do we shake hands in the United States and people elsewhere bow to greet each other? Well, I don't know. It's just that's the way we're told to do it. And if you don't do it that way, you're wrong. But it's not like in some sense you're irrational if you do it that way. And it's not like you can, if you do it wrong, we just say, no, you're not doing it right. But even like a child or a dog could do it wrong in some sense. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Indian word because I know I'm going to butcher it and anyone of Indian descent will laugh at my butchering of the N-A-M-A-S-T-E with an apostrophe, the one
Professor?
Yeah, I know that I, as an American, if I were to say it the way in which it's said in yoga classes, I'd sound like an idiot. So
It's pronounced namaste.
But isn't there like isn't there like tonal elements that I can't master? And I don't want to sound like an ignorant American. Anyway, namaste. I just know that I'm not supposed to say namaste, because then I just sound like a yoga instructor who doesn't know what they're doing and is culturally appropriating. And no offense to you who are yoga instructors, I'm just incredibly sensitive to this sort of thing. Anyway, back on topic. Impartial. What do we mean by impartial? What is something that's impartial? Well, what is something that's partial? And I don't mean partial in the sense of not whole.
That applies equally to everyone, maybe?
Exactly. Thank you, Jorge. That's spot on. It's fair, or it applies the same to everyone. So it's not like you get special privilege because of who you are. It's not like this rule applies unless your name is George Smith, or this rule applies unless you're I don't know, Donald Trump. That's not the way this works with moral laws. Moral laws apply the same to everyone. We don't think like, you know, this person is who they are, so the rules don't apply to them. They're special. So we think that morality is the same for everyone. No matter who you are, no matter what your story is, there are certain things that you should do. You should not get special privilege as an individual. Now, we do have a case that there are moral laws that can apply to different groups differently. So, for instance, we think that if you're if you're a mother, you can use degrees of force to protect your children that might be different from the degrees of force that somebody else could use to protect those same people. But it's not like you, Sally, get to punch someone in the face, but you, Georgina, do not. These are the sorts of cases in which we mean impartial versus partial. You don't get special treatment. It's fair. So everybody follows the same rules, and those rules apply equally to everyone. That's all we mean by impartial. And then public. What do we mean by public? Well, what is something public compared to something that's private?
Shared by all, and it's enforced by the state or government.
Yeah, it seems like it's something that is universally, like people can become aware of it. Like there's some sense in which like the laws of physics, we had to discover what the laws of physics were. And that involved a whole lot of science and involved a lot of math and things I don't fully understand. But it seems like we think that anyone who is a rational, conscious being can at least think about rightness and wrongness. And maybe there's some disagreement about what counts as right and what counts as wrong, but everyone understands that there are rules that say certain things are right and certain things are wrong. Unlike in this case of physics, where like somebody had to come along and say, oh, there is this thing called, I don't know, friction. Everyone knows there's moral rightness and moral wrongness. So that's what we mean by public. It's just like every person can have a debate about what's right and what's wrong. Everyone can engage with these questions. It's not something that's saved for the physicists or saved for the ethicists or saved for the philosophers. Everybody is allowed and has a right to make these moral judgments and have debates about what counts as right and what counts as wrong. So that's all we mean by public. And this is different from like the law, where it feels like who gets to write the laws, who gets to decide what the rules are, who has access to deciding what the rules are. Well, it seems like only certain lawmakers get to decide, and in certain countries where the law isn't even like public knowledge, that's even less public in this case. So does everyone, now I'm not asking everyone to remember the details of these, and you're never going to be quizzed on these. This is just to give you a bit more of a feeling of the difference between a moral law or a moral rule and a non-moral rule, just so we have some idea, something we can refer back to, some way in which we can keep in mind. Because one of the things that we're going to come up to again and again this semester during this class is there in the realm of cyber, so in the cyber technological realm, there is a major disconnect between the law and morality. And one of the great things, like one of the main lessons we're going to be talking about over and over and over this semester, is that in many areas and in many places, we have clear senses that something is morally wrong, and because of that, there are laws around it. So things governing fair working conditions. In the United States, we have a sense that if you're being told by your boss you have to work 50 straight hours with no lunch break, there's some sense that that's immoral. There's something that boss is treating you poorly. They are treating you unfairly. They are doing something that is morally wrong. And because of this, we have laws in this state that govern practices around working. What we find, though, is at first these laws didn't exist. It took time. It took new technologies developing, and then people coming along and saying, wait, that's really screwed up. We need laws around this. Well, with cyber technology, there's a lot of things that we look at and we go, wait a second, that seems morally wrong, but the law in no way says that's illegal. So one of the main things to ask yourself throughout the semester is, like, this might be very well legal, but should it be? Is it okay? Do we need to change the laws? Do we need to be aware that the law is not going to protect us, and therefore we need to impose our own moral code to govern our behavior? Or is the sort of thing of like, know that there are going to be people out there who are going to take advantage of you because the law has these loopholes, because there are these gray areas. So this is the main thing I want you to take away from this. It's just the difference between morality and law, and keeping in mind the sense of what sorts of things, just generally speaking, make something a moral rule as opposed to a legal matter or opposed to a social norm or something like that. All right, any questions thus far? We doing okay? Any
I'm
questions? Good. Questions, comments, concerns, feelings, anything at all? I'm gonna take a sip of water. I'm sure this will be great YouTube viewing later. All right. So, anyway, so we said morality is or ethics, let's do this. We said ethics was the study of morality. Now, I want to talk about what it is to study morality, or what is it to do ethics. And basically, the way you can think of it is this. As I said, we all have some sense of that there are certain things that are right, and there are certain things that are wrong. But most of the time in our everyday lives, most of the situations we come up with, it's pretty obvious to us what's right and what's wrong. So for instance, we know it's wrong to murder people. We know it's wrong to steal. We know it's wrong to curse out children. We know it's wrong to kick puppies. Like, these are all things we don't have to think about hard. So then, why do you want to study morality? Well, the fact is that not every situation you're in your life is going to be simple and straightforward. And if you find yourself in a situation that's unlike anything you've ever been in before, or unlike things, or somewhat different from things you're familiar with, then what you have to do is figure out how you should act in this case, even though you've never faced a situation like this before. And the only way you can really do that, no one's going to come along and say like, oh, this is what you should do, unless you have like a personal, like, I don't know, unless you have a little angel who sits on your shoulder like in old movies and like whispers in your ear what you should do. You're not going to have anyone telling you what you should do. You're going to have to think about it, and you're going to have to come up with your own idea of what you can do. So how is it that you go about deciding this? What sort of thing should you do? Well, it seems like there are a few different ways of doing this, but what I want to talk about is what exactly this entails. And basically what it comes down to is you think of how you behave in clear-cut cases, obvious cases, and then you see, well, why is it the right thing to do in that case? If it's wrong to murder, why is it wrong to murder? Well, if I know it's wrong to murder because of XYZ, then any case in which XYZ holds true, I'll know not to do that thing. So if it's wrong to murder because it starts with the letter M, like if I think about it hard, I'm like, why is it wrong to murder? And I say, oh, it's because it starts with the letter M, then it should also be immoral to move. And it should also be immoral to muddle or whatever else one would do. Now, of course, that's a stupid rule, but that's the sort of thing you're doing. So what you do is you look at how you do ethics is you look at particular cases, see if you can come up with rules that apply, and then see if you can use those rules in new cases you've never faced before to help you decide what to do in those strange new situations. So does that make sense to people? So for instance, if you've just gone into a candy, or you've gone into CVS, you want to get on the line, you want to buy a few things. So you grab, as you're entering, you grab a candy bar, and you're holding the candy bar in your left hand, and then you're going around and you grab like Band-Aids and aspirin and other things, and you're holding all those in your right hand, and then you get a text. And so you put the candy bar in your back pocket, grab your phone, and it's your mom saying, hey, I need you to come home right now, your little brother's sick. So what you do is you see the things in your right hand, you put them on the shelf, put your phone back in your pocket, you walk out. You're down the block 20 feet, and you suddenly realize, oh crap, I still have the candy bar in my pocket. What should you do in this case? What should you do? And how would you go, more importantly, how would you go about answering this question? What would you do in your case? And there's not a right answer to this. I don't think there's a right answer of what you should do in this case. Just how would you go about trying to think about this?
Maybe you could just go back, apologize to the cashier, just didn't pay for it. But at the same time, it's like, I'm not even sure. Like, if you walk out of a store, you get like 20 feet out and nobody comes after you, because they usually have like the detectives or whatever. So like, I don't know, like it's kind of weird, but yeah, just go back and pay for it.
Yeah, so one thing you might want to think is, I should pay for this. And you might ask, but then here's the question, why do you think you should go back and pay for it? What is it about it that makes it the case that you think you should pay for it?
Shoplifting, or anything type of stealing, shoplifting, it's basically the same term, but
You can get done from the store and not be able to go back.
yeah.
But there's one sense in which you think stealing is wrong. It's just wrong to steal. So you might ask yourself, why is it? Because stealing is wrong. Another thing you might say is, my reputation matters, or I represent my family and I owe it to them not to break the law. What are some
You don't
other
want
things?
fines either.
Pardon?
You don't want to get fined either.
I don't want to
you
get fined. Another thing you might think is, and so one thing this shows is it's kind of bringing together moral elements with non-moral elements. So for instance, in this case, you would get in trouble if you got caught for shoplifting. And so one thing you might say is like, oh, it might be morally wrong for me to do it, or morally right, but what really matters is I don't have the money to pay for this. So therefore, practically speaking, I shouldn't do it. Another thing that might affect it is guilt. And if you feel really, really bad about it, then you might say it would be unfair to me. Like I would be doing myself a disservice, and I would suffer and I would cause suffering in this world if I don't pay for this thing. So in some sense, that might not be a moral condition, but in another sense it is, because you're taking your own well-being. Another one you might think is like, well, it will hurt the company. You know, they spent the money to bring this candy bar, but then you took it and they don't get paid for it. But you might then look at this and be like, wait a second, does CVS, are they really going to be crippled if I take one candy bar? Well, maybe not. So this is the sort of thing you're going to think of. Now, if it's a little mom and pop shop where they're like, COVID has killed their customer base and they're really suffering, and there's a sign that says, please buy things or else we're going to go out of business, then it might change your views. And so these are the sorts of things you're going to consider. Jorge, you had a hand. You were going to say something.
No, I was just agreeing with you.
Oh, yeah.
Like corporation against mom's up.
Yeah. And so it seems like another thing you might think is, what does this suggest? Well, these are the sorts of considerations that seem to come up. It's, are you hurting someone? Are you breaking a rule? Are you causing yourself or anyone else pain? Like another thing you might think is that, like, if you do this and you don't bring it back, you see the look, like say the guard saw you walk out with it and the guard is your friend and you know that they'd have to like report you to their superior, and they're going to feel really uncomfortable because that's going to put them in a really tough situation. Either they have to lie to their superior or they have to turn in their best friend. So you might think, well, I want to take them into account, so I'm going to pay for it to make their life easier. Another thing you might take into account is, oh, the reason I had to run is my little sibling is sick and my mom is trying to work from home while he's throwing up in the bathroom. So maybe you might think, well, in the grand scheme of things, the loss to the company is less than the amount of suffering for my brother or my mother. So therefore, in this case, stealing might be the right thing to do. So this is or at the very least, this accidental case of stealing might seem okay. So it seems like when you're approaching ethical questions, this is the sort of thing you do. You think about the situation you're in, which is going to be a little bit different from ones you've been in before, and then you just go through and think, well, what different sorts of considerations do I need to take into account as I go about this sort of case? And the ideal situation is what you do is you identify some general rules or some general principles that underlie your behavior. And then you try to apply those principles to particular cases. And you try to understand, like, why is this a rule? Why is stealing wrong? And once I know why stealing is wrong, then I find another situation which isn't quite stealing because it's not illegal, but has some similarities to it. So for instance, in a certain sense, you might think, why is stealing wrong? Well, you're taking something from somebody who worked hard for it. Well, now you can imagine a case in which a little child like picks 14 flowers and then the bigger child punches that one and takes their flowers. In some sense, it's not illegal. Like there's nothing morally wrong, or there's nothing like legally wrong. You can't prosecute this child for taking the flowers. But you might say in a sense, so it's not technically stealing, but in another sense, it is morally wrong still because you're taking something from someone who worked really hard about it. Worked really hard for it. So does everyone understand just the general way in which you go about deciding these sorts of ethical issues? What you do is you look at cases you're familiar with, try to pull out these sorts of principles that you've encountered or thought of before. Then you try applying them in new cases and see if you can, if those applications help you understand what you should do in these new situations. And in some sense, this should be common sense because you've been doing this sort of thing your whole life. You've just not done it and gotten credit for it. Another way you can think of this class is just like getting credit for something you've been doing your whole life. And if you think of it that way, it's just a lot easier. You have to write papers on something like common sense, just applied to computer realms. All right. If we're on board with that, what I want to do now is talk about there's basically two views I want to talk about of ethical theories that various historical figures have accepted or thought of, and why these particular views in some senses are good and are useful for making our ethical decisions, and in some senses are bad and are not good ways of making our ethical decisions. And what I basically want to do is just give some tools, not perfect tools, but tools that we can turn back to later in the semester when we're looking at actual concrete examples of ethical issues in a technological framework. And we can say, oh, in this case, I don't quite know what we should do, but here's how this theory we talked about in class 2 might apply to it. So does that make sense to people, how this fits in here?
Yes.
All right, awesome. So what I want to do now is basically, how many of you are familiar with the trolley problem? What I want to do is basically run the trolley problem, pull out the two main theories that are tied in with the trolley problem, talk about what those theories are, namely utilitarianism and deontological views, say what the strengths and weaknesses of them are, and how those strengths and weaknesses affect the way we can use those theories in future cases. So anyone who's familiar with the trolley problem, do you want to say what it is? Or I can just go ahead and start. I mean, I'm going to start drawing, and either somebody can explain it while I'm drawing, or else I can do it after I'm done drawing.
So basically what it is that one person has a switch or is near a switch, and you have a train coming, that can only be stopped, or it can't be stopped, but you can switch the track, and there's 2 tracks. One has 5 people, and the other has 1. So would you switch the track to save the 5, or would you just leave it to kill the 5 and save the 1, basically?
That's a great description. So yes, there's basically, imagine there's a train coming down the tracks, and on this train is it's plugging along. And the way the train is set up right now, it's going down the tracks. And say there are 5 workers on this track. 3, 4, 5. And imagine they're construction workers, and they've been told there'll be no trains today, but unbeknownst to them, here comes a train, and they've got those big noise protecting headsets on so they can't hear the train, and you're standing here next to a button. And what this button does, this is you. You've got an exceptionally long arm and one short arm, and you are standing here next to this button. The way this button works is it controls the tracks on the train. So the way the train tracks work is if you don't press, basically at any break like this, there's a track that'll move and will control which way the train goes. So if you don't do anything, this train is going to keep going and it's going to hit these 5 workers and kill them. Now, if however you press the button, the train track will turn and go this way. So if the train track turns and goes that way, what would end up happening is there's just one worker over on this side. He also has on, or she or they also has on the big headset so they can't hear. But if you press this button and it moves, it's only going to hit one person. So if you just stand there and do nothing, 5 people will die. If you press the button, 1 person will die. This is a classic ethical case. It's an ethical dilemma. There is a consequence for either one, and the question is, what should you do? What should a person do in this case? So out of curiosity, how many of you think you should press the button? Raise your hand, type in the chat, whichever one. I just want to get a general gist. How many of you think you should press the button so that the train track moves and that 1 person gets run over instead of 5 people?
I would.
Okay.
If I was forced to, like, if to choose between just those 2 options.
I mean, this is a situation you might find yourself in, or those are the situation. Now, as a matter of fact, generally the majority of people say, I think it's like 70% of people say they would press the button. I think it changes based on group to group, but generally this case in this way, they would press the button. So those of you who would not press the button, I see a couple nods. Any other nods? You would not press the button. Okay, we've got a handful of nods. So, simply put, those of you who would press the button, or more importantly, those of you who think you should press the button, why should you press the button? What is your reasoning behind this?
Save more lives.
More people live. So if you do nothing, 1 person lives and 4 people or 5 people die. So the net thing, less casualties. Basically, if you do nothing, 5 people die. It has a consequence that 5 people die, and so they all die. Getting run over by a train doesn't sound like the best way to go. Plus, then you have 5 families who suffer. You have 5 people who are likely to possibly be parents suffering. So those are more children, and they all have moms and dads and everything else. So there's just going to be more casualties this way, more suffering if you do nothing. If, however, you press the button, it's going to just be 1/5 as many. So this is the intuition or the kind of gut feeling that a lot of people have, that what matters is that more people live. And one way you might put this is it has better consequences. So this is one way of answering a moral question. You look at it and you say, which one has the better consequences? Now, just out of curiosity, I'm going to pack these away for talking about later in class, because we're going to come back to, I don't think, again, there's a right side here. This is the classic. The reason this case still gets talked about is that there's still disagreements about what you should do. Those of you who wouldn't press the button, or think a person shouldn't press the button, what are some of your reasons for it, or why do you think that's the case? And I'm not going to judge any of these reasons. There are many good reasons to not press this button. Just out of curiosity, what are people's thoughts on it?
It's because if you press the button, you're that one person that's in your hands, and if you press the button, you are technically killing somebody. The 5 people, this is really bad, but it's technically not in my control. That's in the control of the train and this situation that's happening. The minute I press the button, I'm sentencing one person to their death, and that's on my hands.
Professor, can I say something?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, at first, I thought what most people think about saving, you know, the like causing the least amount of suffering.
Mhm.
But afterwards, I thought about it, and I'm making the decision to kill a person. Like I wasn't okay with it.
And so there are a couple different things you could say here. One thing you could say, which is kind of this one, which is the killing versus letting die case, it seems like there's some difference here between the two cases. And I want to come back to this one, because this is what we're going to talk about in the second case. We're going to give a slightly different variety of the case that really plays up this difference and suggest that it's not always just about the consequences, and there are other principles that seem to operate too. But another thing you might say is you might come up with a case in which you still think that it's a matter of the consequences, but actually what you want to say is the consequences in these two cases are actually not what you might think they are at first. So for instance, if you feel that you'd be killing this person and you'd be racked by guilt for the rest of your life, and that guilt is so much that you would like maybe one day commit some, I don't know, like you get so depressed that you then buy a firearm and have a mental breakdown and go into a public place and you just know that this could happen, then maybe you'd say, well, actually you have to not press the button and you have to run away, because actually the consequences would be worse if you press the button and kill this one person. So that would be one way in which you could disagree with what the consequences are and how to evaluate them. But it would still be a matter of the right thing to do is the one that has the better consequences. So in ethical theory across history, there have been a lot of people who think that the ultimate decider of what is right and what is wrong. What would I do in this situation? I'd press the button personally. I don't necessarily think that's the right answer, but I do think I would press the button. Yeah. I'm glad that nobody went with the middle range option, which is like try to stop the train yourself, because then I have to come up with all sorts of ridiculous things that make it the case that you're not allowed to do that. And so thank you for making my life a little bit easier. I usually have to talk about having your feet glued to the ground or things like that. But anyway, better consequences is one of the main views. And anyone have an idea of what an ethical theory, or what big fancy word we could give to an ethical theory that thinks the correct way to define things is in terms of the one with the best consequences? Anyone have an idea of what sort of view you might call this? Cynthia, you're actually a step ahead. What you're describing is like the species of this particular type of theory. So all of you, those of you who are saying utilitarianism are correct. You're just one step ahead. There are different types of utilitarianism is like one flavor of this type of thing. This view, to go with the simpler one, it's just in philosophers can be very creative. A theory that thinks that the right thing to do is determined by the consequences is simply called a version of consequentialism. Yeah, very fun term. Consequentialism. If you are a consequentialist, you think that the right or wrong thing to do is a matter of the consequences. So if you have two options, one of them has slightly better consequences and one of them has slightly worse consequences, the right thing to do is the one with the better consequences, even if some of those consequences are negative. So in this case, both of them have bad consequences, but in this one, it's -1. This one is -5. -1 is greater than -5. Therefore, the right thing to do is -1. So The most famous type of consequentialism is called, and goes back to you, Cynthia, and you, Anery. What is the correct answer to this one? It's utilitarianism. So utilitarianism is the most famous type of consequentialism. And what does the utilitarianism say? What is the definition of utilitarianism? Anyone who knew that I was ultimately going to look for utilitarianism know what it is?
Is it like when you like want the greatest number of people to like live, I guess in this case?
Yeah, utilitarianism is a moral view that says you want the greatest good, greatest total good. So it's generally going to come down to greatest good for greatest number. So for instance, what a utilitarianism, its benefit of a majority is another way. It's basically what a utilitarian is going to say is it ultimately, what the right thing to do is ultimately a math equation. And what it comes down to is this. Whenever something happens, it's going to cause pleasure to some people and pain to other people. And the correct thing to do in any situation is the one that is going to maximize the pleasure brought into the world and minimize the pain. And that's the way you do it is the overall situation. It's not the one that leads to the highest amount of pleasure for an individual. You rather weigh it across a population. So for instance, you can imagine a case in which so imagine a new company comes along and the CEO knows that if they develop a new technology, it's going to make the company a ton of money. And he, who owns a lot of stock options, is going to get very, very rich. And with that, he's going to be able to buy a bigger house, and he and his family are going to be very, very happy. But to do this, the workers are going to have to work 20-hour days for 6 weeks. And they aren't going to get paid overtime because they're all on salary. So he's going to ask his workers to work 100-hour weeks for 2 months on end. But in the long run, he and the company are going to make a lot of money. What is a utilitarian going to say about this case? Is it morally wrong or is it morally okay for the CEO to demand this?
I would think it's wrong.
It's wrong. Yes, it's going to be wrong. Why? Let's imagine that the amount of happiness the CEO gets by getting a new house and everything else, say he gets plus 1,000 happiness because, he's really happy. He gets a ton of money and the company goes up. However, each worker, and say there's 1,000 people who work at the company, or 100 people who work at the company, each one of them is going to get let's go with 1,000 workers, and each worker, because they have to work such long hours, has minus 10. So each individual has minus 10 times 1,000 workers. You end up with 10,000 pain. So you end up, if this goes through, it's plus 1,000 minus 10,000. So the ultimate net gain is minus 9,000 happiness. And that is worse than a case in which this isn't implemented. Because if it wasn't implemented, the CEO loses 1,000, but each worker preserves 10 times 1,000 plus 10,000. So in this case, it's plus 9,000. A world in which there's 9,000 additional points of happiness is better than a world in which there's minus 9,000. And because what you want is the greatest good for the greatest number or the greatest overall good, it's morally wrong to do this because it's a world and it would lead to consequences that are worse for society or the human population as a whole. So that's the core idea of utilitarianism. The core idea of utilitarianism is that it's just a math equation. You find out what would cause better consequences, judged in terms of how much happiness it would bring into the world, and then that's the right thing to do. So Does that make sense to everyone? In some sense, it's very straightforward and very common sense. So a utilitarian has a really nice, clear understanding of that trolley case. Why is the right thing to do to press the button? Well, the right thing to do to press the button is that only one person dies and the consequences are different. Now, you can imagine a case in which a utilitarian would say that the right thing to do is not press the button. So imagine the trolley case again, but what's something that a utilitarian would say, actually, given these other factors, how could you change the case, like creatively right now, to such a case that a utilitarian would say, actually, don't press the button? What sorts of factors might you change?
Maybe if the if those 5 workers were not deeming as important as the other person, maybe the other person is a CEO, or, you know.
Yeah, or let me just go with a really crazy case. Imagine that on the track here, it's like this. And imagine that you are standing here and you see on the button, you've got 5 here, and you can just tell these are like the 5 dumbest, most useless workers ever in the company. And over here, you actually see that this one guy, he's this guy you've met at a few of the like company meetings, and actually turns out that he is not only a construction worker, he just does this on the side because he likes to stay in shape. Actually, he's a cancer doctor who's 20 days away from curing cancer. And you know that this one person is going to, if this person doesn't die, they're going to cure cancer. If these 5 people die, yes, their family will suffer, et cetera, et cetera. So in this particular case, you'd want to say like, oh, actually the consequences of leaving this person alive are going to be better than the consequences of these 5 people, because in the long run, this person staying alive is going to lead to a lot more positive in the world. So that would be a case in which a utilitarian would also explain, like, the right thing to do here is save this one person, because that one person will have a very good long run downstream effect. If 5 people are homeless and the other is Donald Trump, another of these cases in which who the people are. Now, I think depending on your views on Donald Trump and the homeless, it might change your intuition on this one. But I think that definitely one of the main ways is who is on the tracks and what downstream effects might they have. So if you think this one person is going to cause a lot of good, then that one person is going to stay, and a utilitarian can capture that fact. Also, if this is like an ordinary person and these 5 people are, or you can imagine like this is a serial killer, and no, these 5 people are convicted serial killers, and this is just like a nice little old lady who lives next door to you. Another one of these cases, any sort of way in which the who's on the track and what their downstream effects will be. Another case you might think is, imagine if instead of a trolley case, this one person would be skinned alive, but these 5 people would just be shot in the head. Like, this would be another case in which you'd say, well, the amount of pain of being skinned alive is worse than the amount of pain of getting shot. Therefore, the consequences of this one would be better. So these are the sorts of ways that a utilitarian could explain even these other cases. So it's not just about number of lives, number of deaths. It's rather a matter of overall taking into account how much happiness and how much suffering is brought into the world. So does this make sense to everyone? Does this? All right.
Yes.
All right. So we have a business question now. Give me 1 second. We have to cover 3 more things that I want to address this class. 1, problems with utilitarianism. 2, the other theory. And 3, the problems with the other theory. It is 12:07 right now. I doubt covering these 3 things is going to take our entire class period. Therefore, what we can do is either we can take a 10-minute break now. Actually, no, we take a 15-minute break, so you can all grab whatever, and then we come back. Or we can push through and end a bit early. So we could push through and end by, say, 1:05, 1:10 at the latest. What would people prefer? Taking a break now and running a little later, or ending a little earlier?
I'd rather end early.
Okay. Anyone have strong views? All right. most people want to end early, so let's just go for it and end early. All right. So that's what we will do, which makes it easier for me because I don't have to make multiple video recordings. Anyway, so yeah, if this is the ethical view, what are some problems with it? What are some worries a person might have with utilitarianism? Anyone who's ever thought about the view, or any of you who have learned about it before, or any of you who thought differently in the initial case? What are some thoughts on this? Marcus, you keep trying to say something. I keep cutting you off. Sorry.
It's fine. It's basically act-utilitarianism versus rule. Yeah, individual rights, like as Gilmore says it, if I pronounce his name correctly. One scenario is that's also compared with the Charlie problem is the doctor problem, where 5 people are injured and 1 person is healthy, and the doctor basically decides for like that health. Or if it's not, if it's based on act utilitarianism, the doctor has the ability to decide what to do, and he could just take all the organs from the healthy person to save the 5.
Yeah, so the case Marcus is talking about is you can come up with something just like the trolley problem that even more strongly makes us think that killing 1 person to save 5 is the wrong thing to do. So some of you had the feeling in the initial trolley problem case that you shouldn't press the button because it's killing 1 person to save 5, and there's something wrong about the killing here. But there's another case which makes this even more clear. Imagine we've got 5, you're a doctor, you're a surgeon, and there's 5 people laying here. I'm dying. And these 5 people are dying, and why do they have a smiley face? No, they're very unhappy because they're dying. And these people who are dying, times 5, each one needs an organ. So for instance, one of them needs a heart, 1 heart. 2 of them need lungs, 1 right lung, 1 left lung, 1 right kidney, 1 left kidney. If they don't get transplants for these things in 1 day, what's going to happen is they're all going to die. Now, you're a surgeon who doesn't know what to do, but you also see other patients on the side, and on the side comes in this person who just by pure dumb luck, they've got a cold, so runny nose, but other than their mild cold, they're perfectly healthy, and it just so happens that they've got the same blood type as all 5 of these people. Now, in this case, how could, in theory, you save these 5 people? What could you do as the doctor? Remember, you're a surgeon. What could you, in principle, do? Come on. Don't be shy. You're allowed to say screwed up things in this class. All right, we're playing Hangman. Letters. A. Oh, wait, I think it says 6. Oh. Nope, I was right. A. C. Our person has a head now. T. I don't think there's an I. Let me make sure. This is the one problem. Whenever I play Hangman, I also can't spell, which leads to some problems. S. There is definitely an S. F. I don't think there's an F. F. Yeah, there we go. There's not a B. These are coming through so fast. N, we have. P, there's no. So no P. R. R is a key one. Organ, Organ harvest. Yes, we could harvest this person's organs. We could cut them open, steal their lungs, steal their heart, steal their kidneys, and put them into these dying people. And yes, you just played a game of Hangman to get the word organ harvest. So welcome to my class. Anyway, so these are the sorts of things you could do in this particular case. You could, in principle, take this person, and a utilitarian has to look at this and say, okay, one person dies, but 5 people would live. So a certain flavor of utilitarian would have to say, what's the right thing to do here? The sort of utilitarian we talked about before would say what? They say the greatest good for the greatest number. What would be the right thing to do here?
As an act utilitarian, do it.
Yeah.
But most people, I think, would say no, because like it's just something that feels wrong, I guess, to people. Like most people, at least.
Case, there's just about no one who thinks that the correct thing to do is harvest this person's organs. Just about nobody thinks that that's the right thing to do. However, it looks like an act utilitarian would have to say that's the right thing to do. Why? Because that would have better consequences. You'd have 5 people living and just 1 person dying. You could knock them out. They wouldn't even know they were harvested. You just knock them out. Here's the chloroform thing. Then there's the X on the eye. Take the organs, and suddenly all 5 of these people go from very sad to very happy. So, in this particular case, an act utilitarian, or a utilitarian of the variety we're just talking about, would have to say you should organ harvest. And yet no sane person wants to say that's the right thing to do. So what does this suggest? Well, it suggests the type of utilitarianism, the one that looks at the consequences of every individual action and decides what the right thing to do is based on every single individual action. That's not the right way to decide to do things. So Marcus keeps using these terms, which are the right ones to use. So the type of utilitarian we just talked about is actually called act utilitarianism. And this is somebody who thinks the right thing to do is decide what will cause the most happiness on an individual act or action level. And so an act utilitarian says the right way to decide what's right or wrong is look at the individual circumstance you find yourself in and decide what is the correct thing to do in this case. Well, I analyze what will be the positives of of option A, what will be the negatives, what will be the positives of option B, what will be the negatives. The downside is it looks like there's something horribly wrong, because in this particular sort of case, like the organ harvester, it looks like that is morally wrong. We don't think that that's the right thing to do. However, that's what an act utilitarian says you have to do. So how do you resolve this? This is a classic case of doing ethics or studying ethics. We had a principle. Our principle was you decide what brings about the most good or most bad on a case-by-case basis. And then the right thing to do is the one in that case. We now see that doesn't work in all situations. So now we try another option. So what other options do we have? Well, just to show you where this will go, there are 2 different options we're going to talk about. Rule utilitarianism and deontology. So, rule utilitarianism is in the same way as utilitarianism, thinks you define what the right or wrong thing to do is based on the it's still a matter of the consequences, but you don't look at a case-by-case basis. Instead, what do? Those of you who are familiar with this difference, anyone want to take a stab at it? Give you a clue, it has to do with this word.
It's the set of moral. It's a type of action is not just based on the case. It's based on a justified moral conduct, like it's a rule of conduct or whatever, but it has to be justified, which means that the justified part is like it has to be accepted by like many and proven why like it's justified and like a bunch of other stuff, basically like laws.
Yeah, so you're along the right path here. So the idea is, like utilitarianism, act utilitarianism, you say what's right or wrong based on the consequences. But instead of saying it's the consequence of an individual action, you instead come up with a bunch of different rules to govern a society. And what are the rules you pick? Well, you pick the ones that, when applied generally, will lead to a better world. So, for instance, a world will, in general, have better consequences if there's a general principle: no organ harvesting. So what you do, and why is it? Well, a society that doesn't allow organ harvesting is a better society, and there will be more overall happiness for society as a whole than a society that allows organ harvesting. Or a society that says, so you don't want organ harvesting, and so because it's got better consequences, this would be a case in which you'd say that's a rule we have in our society, or more generally, no murdering people or no killing people. In that sort of case, well, you decide, why is it? Well, a society that outlaws that or says that's morally wrong is going to be better than one that says it's morally okay. So that's what rule utilitarianism says. Rule utilitarianism says we were right to do it in terms of calculating happiness for the greatest good. It's just we don't look at a case-by-case basis. On an individual case, you're just following general rules. But those general rules are decided upon in utilitarian ways. So how do you decide what to do as an act utilitarian? You go, well, what will the positive consequences be? What will the negative consequences be? As a rule utilitarian, you go, okay, what should I do in this case? Should I harvest this person's organs or should I not harvest this person's organs? Well, what rules do I have in my society? Well, I have a rule that says don't kill people for any reason except self-defense. Therefore, is this a case of self-defense? No. Therefore, I shouldn't do it. And why is that a rule? Well, because a society with that rule is overall going to be happier in the long run. Everyone on board with that difference between rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism? Does this make sense to people? All right. I hope I didn't lose too many of you by playing hangman for the phrase organ harvest. All right, quick test. How many of you are still alive? Quick test.
I am.
Okay, awesome. Raise your little hands or shout or awesome. Okay, good. Every once in a while I get a little afraid I crossed the line with organ harvesting, but you know, what can you do? However, there's an issue here. So background, we've talked about two versions of utilitarianism, but there's still some worries with utilitarianism as a whole. So does anyone think they can come up with any issues that apply both to act and rule utilitarianism? What are some of the worries that you might have here? And there's a lot of worries that one might come up with in these cases. So one of them is justice. And it seems like what I want to talk about with justice, I'm going to save that over here. It just, the justice objection in this particular case, the justice objection is most directly aimed at act utilitarianism, but there are some worries about justice. But there seems to be a general worry here that a lot of people have, that just consequences aren't the right way to go about deciding what's right and wrong. And I think part of the reason for that is there's a practical worry, which is how on earth do you calculate consequences of right and wrong? For instance, remember when I was talking about the case of the CEO? The CEO who decides to make the new policy that's going to make his workers work their butts off and make them all miserable? How did I describe that case? What did I use? I said it was a math equation. And so what did I use in those cases?
Happiness and
I used happiness. And what did I describe? How did I describe happiness? What did I use? That you can still see the marks here. What are these? Numbers? Yep, Cynthia, I'm asking the dumbest question possible, and the correct answer is numbers. The correct very often I'm going to ask questions that are really looking for like straightforward, simple answers. And a lot of you are going to find it hard to answer because the answer I'm looking for is so dumb and like straightforward. So if at any time you're like, what on earth is professor asking for? The odds are I'm asking for a really simple answer, and just like treat me like the dumb I am and we'll all get to the correct answer. So if you're confused and you think I'm looking for a really complicated answer, just I'm usually looking for a rather straightforward, simple one. So in this case, numbers. And what do these numbers stand for? Well, I said it was 1,000 units of happiness versus 10,000 units of happiness. Now, how many of you measure your happiness every day?
I don't think anybody really can measure happiness.
Yeah, there's a fundamental issue here with utilitarianism, which is it assumes that you can measure happiness. You can't really measure happiness. How do you define what would make you happier right now? Having a really delicious meal or seeing a friend that you haven't been able to see in person for a while?
Damn, that's a
I don't
tough
know.
choice.
It's like, how would you even measure that? What would make you happier? A massage or a nap? I don't know. How do you even do? What is happiness? Like whatever it is changes from both people. Like it's really difficult to say. Everyone's got different views. Some people prefer one thing, other people prefer other things. Some people like the number one thing is, bills getting paid. That's a big one, and the stress that relieves. Other people are like, yeah, I'm fine never paying my credit card bill. I just want to go out and party, and I'm gonna break COVID protocols to do it. Like there's no easy way of doing this. So well, in some sense, you might think like utilitarianism, great. We measure it based on the overall happiness. Here's the problem. How the hell do you do those calculations? You can't do these calculations. You don't have like a happiness meter where you like stick it into your arm and get like your blood sugar ratings. Like that's not how it works. So in some sense, utilitarianism feels almost kind of useless in practice. In some cases, like it's very easy to say like, oh yes, obviously killing 12 billion people will have worse consequences than stubbing your toe. But like outside of these obvious cases, it doesn't look like you can actually do these calculations. Another one is it seems to require you to be able to predict the future. And it seems like what's right or what's wrong is going to depend on what the consequences of your action are. And a lot of times we have a lot of unforeseen consequences from our actions. And it seems so like imagine going back to our trolley case, that one person is a doctor, but you don't know they're a doctor. So when you press the button, you kill the cure to cancer. So in some sense, what you did was wrong. And say a rule that says, don't kill people. Well, in this case, it looks like if you think that pressing the button doesn't kill anyone, you just think, it let someone die. It still seems like if you killed the cure to cancer, you did something wrong. And yet, how can you be responsible for this sort of case? So it seems one way of saying this is act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. They generally leave a lot of so I'm just going to write issues with utilitarianism in general. They leave a lot of room for moral luck. And a lot of people don't like moral luck. And by this, what it means is what counts as right and wrong depends on luck. And it doesn't seem like morality. It seems like with morality, you should have control over it. Whether or not, like, if you save somebody's life and then they immediately go home and go on like a drunken bender and run over 3 children, then the consequences of your actions were worse. And like if you have a rule that says save people, but then you like saving this person causes so many terrible consequences that like act utilitarianism kicks in, then it seems like moral luck has struck. And we don't like moral luck. We don't want to say that what you did is wrong just because saving a person led to bad consequences down the line. We want to say it was still the right thing to do to save them, even if it ends up having negative consequences, or even if what it does is it turns out that what you thought you were doing wasn't quite what you were doing. You thought you were saving someone, but you were actually saving a murderer or something like that. All right, another issue. So we've got the moral luck issue. We've got the defining issue. The final one I want to talk about is the tyranny of the majority. it seems like even with rule utilitarianism, it seems like you can have a rule that would benefit the majority of people and would be the right thing to do because it would benefit the majority of human beings in a society. And because of that, what it allows for, and I guess this goes back to the justice objection from before, is even with rule utilitarianism, you can build it into the system that you can cause incredible amounts of pain to an individual person if it will bring pleasure to a large enough number of people. So for instance, imagine you've got a society of many, many people who just love torture. These people just love watching individuals get skinned alive. They love watching people get crucified. Like, it brings them incredible joy. And in case you're thinking, like, what sort of crazy society is this? Just like think back to ancient Rome. What was a very popular form of entertainment in Rome? Any takers? Starts with a G and ends in a gladiators.
Gladiators.
Yeah, gladiators. So what was a gladiator fight? You put two humans in a ring and make them fight each other to the death. They also, fun fact, during the lunch break, so the way that a gladiator fight would work is in the mornings, you make humans fight animals and animals fight other animals. And then in the afternoon, you'd make humans fight other humans. And during lunch break, to help you with your digestion, they'd perform the public execution. So right as you're like eating your ancient Roman version of your hot dog or sausage or whatever you'd buy at a ball game, you'd sit there and you'd watch some people get crucified, because that helps with digestion in the same way that, you know, watching baseball does. So that's something that, like, literally, and the Colosseum could seat 60,000 people. Like, we're talking the size of a modern, like, football stadium full of people to watch people kill each other. So this is not, like, absolutely out of the realm of possibility. So, but because of this, in a society in which 60,000 people get to watch the gladiator fights and 2 people die, you could argue that in this society, the morally right thing to do is have a rule that says allow gladiator fights. Because 60,000 people getting to watch, on top of that, there'd be great games and celebrations, and basically the whole city of Rome, which had 1 million people at the time, would have been increasing in happiness, and just some humans would die, and in some cases, some animals would die. So you might argue that even if you're a rule utilitarian, the right thing to do in Roman society was allow gladiator fights to continue. However, that's not something that everyone is happy with. And why people want to say this is there's something unjust, or there's something about individual rights or individual values that is being exploited by a society that thinks it's okay to kill a few people for the entertainment of the masses. And so these are some of the issues with rule and act utilitarianism. It seems like what's right or wrong comes down to luck in certain cases. It seems like you can't define happiness or no in many cases, so it's practically useless. And in many cases, the right thing to do according to utilitarianism, both the act and rule variety, is something that involves sacrificing the well-being of an individual for the overall well-being of a very large number of people. And many of us do not feel comfortable with this consequence. So does everyone understand this bit of, we've kind of gone along, we said, here's the trolley problem. In the trolley problem, we've got a case in which it feels like the right thing to do is to how to decide on the right thing to do is to choose what's going to have the best consequences. Now, we started with the act case, and we said, well, that's got some problems. Well, let's try the rule case. Well, that's got some problems too, namely these. So what are we left to do? How can we go about deciding what's right and wrong if utilitarianism isn't going to get us the answer? So does this make sense to everyone? Are we on board with how the structure of this whole discussion's gone? I want to make sure I've got everyone here still a little bit. All right. So that's the first 2 parts of, or that's the first part of what we still have to do. Now the last bit should be quicker. The last bit is let's go back to our initial trolley case and change it a little bit. So what we're going to do now is consider an alternative way of approaching ethical questions. And this ties in with what some of you talked about in the as your reason behind not pressing the button in the first place. So it seems like we have this intuition or this judgment that there's a difference between killing someone and letting someone die. So to bring this out more fully, I want to talk about a particular version of the trolley case. So imagine here's the trolley. It's going along. The trolley's getting uglier and uglier, but what can you do? Okay. And then you are standing on a bridge overlooking this trolley. And standing next to you is another person. Now, just like in the other case, there's 5 times people on this track. Only this time, there's no button to flip or switch to pull. Instead, you realize that this trolley is just going to hit these people unless something stops the trolley. Now imagine you work for the trolley company and you know that this trolley is has a system that if it hits something hard, the brakes slam on. And based on the distance here, the train would have time to stop before it hits these 5 people. However, you see the trolleys coming pretty fast. And on this platform, you're standing pretty far back. And you know that you can't get in front of the trolley in enough time to stop it. You don't have anything with you that you can, but you know that this person who's standing right on the edge, if they were to fall in front of the trolley and get hit by the trolley, then they would get smushed, but the trolley would stop before it hit these 5 people. So the question is, should you push this person so that they go tumbling in front of the trolley and stop it? Or should you just stand here and do nothing? So in this case, it's similar to the first one, trolley 5-1. The question is, should you push this person in order to stop the trolley? How many people in this case think you should push the person? I'm curious if there's anyone. Yeah, you happen to work for the company. Just because you know, or you engineered it, or something about you know how the trolley works. Very, very few people say they would. Usually there's a couple people who still have the intuition that this is the right thing to do is push the person, but generally our judgments flip. Generally, most people think you shouldn't push the person. So why not? What's the fundamental difference between this case and the first one? What is it for those of you whose views have changed, and I put myself in this camp, what is it about the 2 situations that makes it different?
You have to push somebody with your own hands.
Push with hands. Anyone else? So what is it? What's the significance of pushing with hands? Say
It's
you
direct
didn't have
contact.
to do it with your hands. You could headbutt them. Would that make a difference?
No, it's the same thing because it's basically indirect. It's directly killing somebody and indirectly killing somebody, or versus indirectly killing somebody.
Kill versus let die. And so if we actually map out the case here, let me draw the difference here. I'm just going to erase this. It looks like if we were to draw the cause of what happens in the 2 cases, it looks like you push button, button moves tracks, train hits person. In this case, you push person who hits train. And so there's just some sense in which this is much closer. And it seems in this case, how did you hit this person or what? It seems like you in no way caused the train to hit the person in a way you did in this case. It looks like in this case, all you acted upon was this button. And this button, so Khalid, this is the case in which, all right, not only do you work for the company, for some reason, you had a nail gun malfunction and you nailed your own feet into the platform, so you can't actually jump off. All you can do is push the person. So your only options are push person or not push person, because you're stapled to the floor and you can't move. So let's build in that into the case, just to prevent you all from being very, very clever people who can always find loopholes. This just shows that you're reasonable people who are very clever and like to find loopholes, and I have to come up with crazy cases where you don't get to find your loopholes to keep it on track. But yeah, you're 100% right that in an actual practical case, throwing yourself in front of the train could maybe be an option, if you really want to save those people. But it seems like there's some difference, and it seems like in some sense, the main difference is in this case, this tool, the way you stop it is there's a button here. You use the button as the tool to save the life or kill the person. In this case, it looks like maybe what's happening is you're using the person as a tool. The person is the object that is stopping the train. So this type of thing, this way of answering the question, and the core idea here between the killing versus letting die, the intuition we have here is the intuition which motivates a view of ethics called deontology. And now, what is deontology? Deontology is a view of ethics that instead of basing things on consequences, it says it's a matter of duty. It's a matter of what your duties are as a human being. And in particular, well, first off, what do we mean by duty? What is a duty? Other than if you say it a lot repeatedly, it sounds funny.
You're obliged to do something.
Yeah, it's
basically
something
obliged.
you're obliged to do. So what are some examples of duty? Something you have to do, the job you're assigned to do. So what are some classic cases of duties for certain sorts of people? If you're a soldier, what are some of the duties you have?
Protect the base, fight in a war. If there's a grenade in the building and you have your team jump onto it.
Yeah, that's what we mean by duty. It's something that you have to do, even if the consequences to yourself might be somewhat negative. So for instance, if you're a soldier, you cannot leave your post, even if you want to. Even if you don't want to jump upon a grenade, you have to do so, because that is what your duty is. Paying taxes is a duty. We have a duty as citizens of the United States to pay taxes. This is what we're talking about with duties. So deontology says that ethics is a matter of duties as well. There are certain things you have to do, even if you don't want to do them. And in particular, what deontology says is that you have duties that you have to fulfill as a rational human. Now, remember, going back to what we said at the start of class, we think of ethical rules as tied to rationality. You have to follow certain things. Like if you think that A is true and you think that B is true, then you have to also conclude that A and B are true. If you think it's going to snow and you think snow is cold, then you have to think that it's going to be cold and snowy. These are just rules that, in some sense, humans have to follow to count as rational creatures. So, deontologists think that morality is ultimately a matter of following rational rules. And in particular, there are certain rules that we all have to follow because we all are rational creatures who believe that in some important sense, all humans are equal. In a modern society, we generally think that every human being is created equal insofar as we are rational creatures who can think and have desires and have wants. And because of this, we all have to get the same individual rights. So because we're rational creatures, and these rational creatures have value, we all have certain rights that as individuals cannot be questioned and cannot be affected for the greater good. It seems like at the very nature of us as rational beings, who all are valuable creatures, there are certain things that cannot be done for us no matter what the consequences are. So does that make sense? Just like this general view. And so the idea is that if we're all created equal and we all have to be treated equally, then we can't just use people for other purposes. And so the idea here with deontology and the duty-based deontology of a man called, I don't know if I'm spelling it right. I know I'm spelling his last name right. Immanuel Kant. He's the most famous deontologist. And he thinks that because we're all rational and because we have these individual rights, we cannot treat people as tools to our own ends, because if we're doing that, we're not treating everyone as the same. So if this doesn't make sense, if the theory's a little blurry, that's okay. I want to talk about this practically. So the way Kant thought of ethics is the way you decide what's right and wrong is you have to make sure that any action you perform adheres to the following principle. Must always treat people at least partly as an end in themselves, never simply as a means. So you must always treat people at least partly as an end in themselves, never simply as a means. So what does this mean, pun intended? First off, the idea here is that because everyone is the same, do you value yourself and think that you are worthy of attention and worthy of being treated with respect?
Yes, because
Yes, you
everybody
do.
wants to have respect, and technically, if everybody's equal, you should be able to have that same level of as the others.
Yeah, here's an idea. We all think that we are ourselves worthy of respect. And yet we also know we're just an ordinary person. We all know on some level that we're all just human beings. And if we're all human beings, then everyone else must be like us. So on pains of being irrational or on pains of, being kind of crazy. So if somebody told you, I believe all dogs have fur. No, I believe no dogs can fly. If they tell you this, 1, I believe no dogs can fly. 2, I believe Fido is a dog. 3, I believe Fido can fly. If you met somebody who said these 3 things in a row, what would you say to them? Or what would you do in this situation? They say, I believe that there are no dogs in the world that can fly. And yes, I do know Fido's a dog. I see him right here. But I also know that Fido can fly. I really believe that Fido can fly. What would you say to this person?
They can believe whatever they want, but like, I don't know. In
Would
my
you want to
opinion,
be friends with them? Would you want to spend a lot of time with them? Would you trust them with your children? No, the person's crazy. There's some sense in which they're like off the rails. This is the sort of insane person who morality doesn't seem to apply to. So in the same way, what Kant is saying is if you think everyone's created equal and you think that you as a human have value just because you're a human, then you have to think everyone has value. And so the way you see whether something is allowed is you see whether you're performing an action if you, in that case, are treating someone as someone who has value and is worthy of respect in the same way you are. So, to go on to his fancy terminology, the way you decide whether a particular action is right or wrong is you see if you're treating someone as an end in themselves or simply as a means. Now, what do these terms means and ends mean? How many people have heard these terms together in this context of means and ends? Anyone? You may have heard it in the phrase the ends justify the means. What are these phrases? What is the definition of them? Anyone have an idea?
The good in the end justifies the means of getting there.
Yeah, so the means of getting there. So the idea is just the end is where you ultimately get, or the conclusion you reach, or the goal. So the best way to think about an end is a goal you're trying to reach, and the means is the way of getting there. It can be a thing you use to get there. So if you're trying to get to the store and you get by car, the end is to get to the store and your means are the car, or the means are the journey. If your goal is to if you're trying to, well, let's go with an example. Yeah, the outcome of your actions justifies the actions of themselves is the definition of the ends justify the means. Another way of saying the end is the result. So, for instance, an end probably all of you have is to graduate from John Jay with a degree. What are some of the ends you have, or what are some of the means you follow to get there?
Pass every class.
Pass all your classes. What are some other things? Study is a means. Sign up for classes. Do your homework. Be here. Respond to your professors. Don't call your professor a jackass to their face. Like, all of these are things for passing your classes, which will get you to graduate from John Jay. And once you graduate from John Jay, graduating from John Jay is itself a means to further ends. So things like get a job, be happy, all of these sorts of things. Another means to graduate is pay your tuition. All of these are the ends. So what Kant is saying here is when you are deciding what to do, you have to treat other people as ends in themselves, as goals, as things that are worthy of respect, and not simply as means or tools to reach your own goals. So to go back to the case of pushing someone on the train track, it looks like what Kant would say is this is wrong. It's wrong to push somebody in front of the train because when you're doing it, what you're doing is you are not treating them as somebody with respect. You are just treating them as a mere tool to stop a train. And to back up his idea that what matters here is that we respect them or judge them, imagine that in the trolley case, before, like, you see the train a ways in the distance. And so you know that the only way to stop the train is you push this person in front of it. Now imagine instead of just pushing them, you tap them on the shoulder and say, "Excuse me, good sir, or madam, or however you identify. I have a proposition for you. The situation is that this train is coming, and I know the only way to stop those 5 people from dying is to push you in front of the train. Now, given these circumstances, would you be okay with my pushing you in front of the train? If you say no, I will speak no more of it. But if you say yes, I will push you to save those 5 lives. What do you think, good person?" And they say, "Well, yes, I'm okay getting pushed in front of the train." And you go, "Okay," and then you push them. How many people think that this case is fundamentally different than the first version of the pushing? The case in which you just push them without asking. How many people think at the very least it's less wrong to push them in this case?
I think it's more on to push somebody than just flipping a lever. It's
Well,
fundamentally
no, not the
different.
lever case. Let's ignore the lever case. Compare this with the case. Compare a case in which you just push a person with a case in which you ask them first.
Oh, ooh, that's I think it's like kind of the same thing, but I guess it's more polite to ask.
At the very least, it's not more wrong to ask them. Now, if you ask them, say, "Are you okay with it?" They say, "No, I don't want to be pushed," and then you push them anyway. That's really bad. But in most cases, people, if you genuinely ask them and you say, "Are you okay with this?" and they say, "Well, I've considered it long and hard, and I am okay with this. I have given you my consent to it. I'm okay if you push me," then most people's judgment is it's all right to push them. And why? Well, because in this case, you're treating them partly as someone with respect. You're treating them Like, yes, you are still using them to stop a train, but at the same time, you're taking their views and feelings into account. You're treating them, if you were in their situation, because you're someone who's valuable, you know that you should be asked. Therefore, they should be asked as well. It seems like you should treat them in this sort of way. And so this is the case. Yeah, most people still would feel uncomfortable with it and don't think you should push them, or at the very least, it's still an open question. But just about everyone thinks that you shouldn't push them without asking. And if you ask them, it's at the very least a little bit better. So what this is designed to show is that it does seem that Kant is right. It seems like we have this view that one of the things we decide upon in morality is whether or not our actions are treating another person with respect and treating them as having rights that we cannot just ignore when we're making our decisions. Things that you can decide what to do in these particular cases based upon, or at the very least, you have to take their respect and value as a person into consideration when you're deciding what to do. And so this idea of deontology, you have a duty to respect them as a person because they are humans who are deserving of respect just like you are. And if you ignore them, you are being an irrational being who is outside the realm in which ethics applies. You are no longer a moral agent. You are not somebody we have to care about. So that's the idea of deontology. The idea is you embrace this idea that even if the consequences are bad, sometimes you just have to do the right thing. And doing the right thing comes down to treating people with respect, even if that will have bad consequences for you, even if that will have bad consequences for somebody else on the whole, even if it will be something that you might recognize will hurt other people. You just have to do it because you can't use people as tools to your ends without first taking them into consideration. Now, does this view make sense to people? And it's got a real intuitive pull for many of us. All right. Let me take my last sip of water. Now, I just want to conclude quickly with what the issues with this view are. Because deontology also has some problems to it. This view that the way you decide what's right and wrong is you simply say, am I treating someone partly as an end in themselves, or am I treating them simply as means? Does anyone have any ideas of what some of the issues with this sort of view might be? Any takers? No, and to be clear, I'm not expecting any of you to have answers. I'm just asking. Here's another issue. Remember what we said the issue was with utilitarianism is it's hard to measure what the right thing to do is. However, you might not be able to calculate it and you might not be able to identify it, but just about every case of if you're a utilitarian, you think there's going to be a right answer, and if you could do the calculations, you would know what the right answer is. However, deontology says never treat someone simply as a means. Always treat them partly as an end in themselves. You have duties. But what happens when you have two conflicting duties? So for instance, if you're a soldier who has you have a duty to guard your post, but you also have a duty to protect your fellow soldiers. How are you supposed to decide what to do if there's an attack on the other side of the base? What are you supposed to do here? It doesn't seem like there's a clear case to do. There's no simple way of deciding what the right sort of solution to this is. So in the same case, imagine that, you're a doctor and you have a duty to two people come into the, let's go with an actual practical case. Two people come into your COVID doctor. Two people come into the office, both of whom are gasping for breath and need to be put on one of those high-tech respirators. However, you only have one of these left in your ICU. What do? You have a duty to treat both of these people how they want to be treated, and yet you only have one respirator. What does a deontologist tell you to do in this case? You have to treat them both with respect. What is the problem here?
It's hard to do it with two because there's only like one like machine left. But it's I think what doctors do if that happens, I think it's like whichever one has the more likely to survive, I guess, like has a better chance of surviving, which they like do all this like consideration of factors. But like yeah, that's basically what it is. Just take whichever one has the like more likely chance to survive.
So that's exactly, so what Marcus just demonstrated here is one of the core issues of deontology, which is when deontology presents you with two duties, it's not just hard to decide, it's literally impossible in this situation to treat both people with the correct respect because you don't have the tools for it. You do not have the ability to give them both the life-saving care that you have a duty to give them. Instead, what do you end up doing? You end up calculating what the consequences are of doing both of the different possibilities. In other words, in this situation, it seems like when duties fail, we fall back on utilitarian principles. So what is the doctor doing? Well, the doctor's literally calculating what will be the consequences of my actions. So it looks like deontology doesn't get you an answer in every case. And in fact, in some cases, you seem to have to fall back on utilitarian principles. And so that's one of the issues with deontology, which is sometimes it doesn't give you an answer to what is right and what is wrong. And at the end of the day, we want to know what we should do. An ethical theory that doesn't tell us what to do isn't very helpful. If it tells you, well, if you get in a situation like this, you're just kind of screwed and anything you do is wrong. It's like, well, then why am I using your moral theory in the first place? If I'm trying to decide what to do and all you can tell me is you're screwed, that's not helpful. I'm trying to figure out how I should act as a doctor, and your moral theory is you're screwed. That's the only principle? Well, it looks like utilitarianism might be hard, but at least it gives me an answer in this case. Here's another issue. It seems like every rule outside of mathematics seems to have exceptions. So for instance, thou shalt not kill. That is a classic ethical case. And in fact, a deontologist can give a very nice explanation for why thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not kill because when you're killing, you're very often the reason you're killing is you're just using someone for your own ends. If you're mugging someone and in the process you punch them and they die, well, you were killing them simply as a way of getting to their wallet. That is a case where a deontologist has a very clear case. And yet, in many cases, it seems like, well, come up with an example. Why is it not strictly speaking true that thou shalt not kill? What's the exception to that rule?
If it's in self-defense.
Self-defense is a key case. If somebody's trying to kill you, and in the process of trying to kill you, you defend yourself and kill them, it doesn't seem like it's morally wrong. Or to crank it up even more, if somebody's trying to kill your child, and in the process you kill them, then it seems like in that case, it's still the right thing to do, is to kill them. So thou shalt not kill, great deontological principle, except there seems like there's exceptions. And to go back, it seems like if we go back to the initial case of pushing someone off this in front of the train, it seems like if you raise the consequences high enough, just about everyone flips to being a consequentialist again. So even those of you who felt very strongly in the button case that you shouldn't even press the button, I bet if we put enough people on this track, you're going to change your views. So imagine that instead of this trolley just being a trolley that's going to run over 5 people, this trolley's carrying a nuclear weapon into New York City. And you know the only way to stop this from getting into New York City and blowing up is to push someone in front of the track. Otherwise, 7 million people are going to die. How many people think in this case, 7 million people dying versus pushing one person, you start to feel that maybe you should push the one person? How many people share my intuition that if the stakes get high enough, individual rights start to be a little bit less important?
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
there's too many. That's way too many people. I think
Yeah.
7 million people is just like you affect, and then that's not even including the families that you'll be affecting indirectly as well.
Yeah, and this is another problem with deontology. It says individual rights are always need to be valued, but it seems like there's just this feeling that individual rights end at a certain point. So another classic case is depends on your views on whether or not you should wear a mask during the COVID crisis. It seems like it would be entirely wrong for government to say you have to wear a mask. There's no pandemic going on. Just like if one day COVID had never come along and the government said, you know what? You have to start wearing masks and we think they look cool. Like that would be somehow wrong. But when you end up with a global pandemic, the idea that the government can tell you wear a mask starts to seem a lot more reasonable. And while there are some people who will still say, you know what? The government can't tell me to wear a mask. Most people in the United States think that because the stakes are high enough, your right to not have to keep your face covered is out the window because it is life and death for hundreds of thousands of people and worldwide millions of people. So that's the sort of thing that the case. So deontology seems to have practical issues just like utilitarianism does, but also it runs into this problem of at some point, individual rights seem to run into exceptions. So where does this leave us? Well, we've gone through and said, how do you do ethics? Well, you start with small cases and try to apply them to larger cases. So how do you do that? Well, you start with something you're familiar with, try to find principles, and then apply them generally. And what we've done is looked at two of the most popular views that philosophers and ethicists and even everyday people have used in our lives, namely utilitarianism, both of the act and rule form, and deontology. And what we found is that in most cases, we have, as a matter of fact, in most cases, these two go together so we don't run into many problems. Like in your everyday life, why shouldn't you shoot someone? One person. Well, one, it's going to cause a lot of pain. So a utilitarian says you shouldn't do it. And two, it's violating their rights. So a deontologist says you shouldn't do it. So in most cases, they run together. Now, what we find is in certain cases, utilitarianism seems to be better. And in other cases, deontology seems to be better, which suggests that in our ethics, we seem to have at least two competing views, which is part of the reason that ethics is so difficult. However, what's something to keep in mind is because both of these have good positive sides, what you can do is keep these as tools in the back of your head when we start looking at ethical issues in technological situations. So when we start looking at things like privacy, you can start to be like, oh yeah, the government collecting my data or Google collecting my data to make tons of money for the CEO and violating my privacy. It seems like they're treating me simply as a means to their monetary ends. I should be concerned about this for that reason. And you might also go, well, you know what? Not only that, the benefit to Google is much less than the overall lack of privacy that we as a society have now. Therefore, it's also wrong. Or you might say something like, well, Google is a company, they only put a number on you. They don't know where you live, or at the very least, they don't know what your face is connected to the same file as your movements. So they are still respecting your privacy. They're treating you at least partly as an end in yourself. And also the benefits to society are more by having Google collect this data because Google is such a powerful company who employs so many people. So what we can do is use these ethical views, these deontological and utilitarian principles when evaluating questions that will be coming up through the rest of the semester. So that's really how to think of today's class, just as a practice for what's going to come up in these ethical sorts of situations. And we will sometimes be referring back to these explicitly, but more often we'll just be I'm going to ask you to have them in the back of your head to be like, oh yeah, this is an ethical concern. The fact that Target can know I'm pregnant before my dad does, that is something that I feel uncomfortable with. And this is the sorts of situations this is why. These are the ethical reasons why, even though it's legal, I feel uncomfortable with it and the laws should change. So does that make sense to everyone? Does that just the way this class fits in with more of what's going to come on for the rest of the semester? All right. Are there any questions, comments, concerns, feelings at this point? Anything at all? Marcus?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. Everyone is good. So one last thing, practically speaking, we do not have class next Friday. We do not have class next Friday because it's Lincoln's birthday. And in traditional CUNY fashion, that means we get off a lot of holidays that most other people didn't even know were holidays. So that means we will not have class next Friday. So because of that, I will not see you except for 2 weeks. So you all, I'm sure many of you have jobs and things that you will not be getting a super long weekend, but at least for CUNY, next week is a 4-day weekend. You're off Friday for Lincoln's birthday, and you're off Monday for President's Day, aka Washington's birthday. So I will see you all in 2 weeks. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. This recording will go up on YouTube relatively shortly. As soon as it uploads, I will be able to post it. And if no one has any questions, have a great weekend and enjoy your next week and enjoy not seeing me for 2 weeks. So have a good one, and I will see everyone in 2 weeks.
All right, take care. Stay safe.
Take care.